Today we're heading back in time to the small, unassuming town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a place that for many years existed in blissful obscurity. It was a classic American rural community, built on the foundations of agriculture and the close-knit, often suffocating bonds of neighborly life. But Plainfield's name, like a wound that refuses to heal, would eventually become synonymous with one of the most chilling and bizarre cases in American criminal history, the story of Edward Theodore Gein. This is a tale that is not merely about murder, but about deep, corrosive psychological isolation, fanaticism, and a grotesque blurring of the lines between life, death, and identity. To fully grasp the man and the horrors he committed, we must first understand the environment that shaped him. A cold, unyielding environment dominated by a single powerful woman. The Gein family's journey to Plainfield began in 1914, a time when the world was on the brink of profound, agonizing change. Yet this corner of Wisconsin remained stubbornly anchored in the past. The family consisted of 4 individuals: George Philip Gein, the father; Augusta Wilhelmina Gein, née Lerche, the mother; and their 2 sons, Henry George Gein and Edward Theodore Gein. Ed, the younger of the 2 boys, was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin in 1906 and was just a young boy when his mother, Augusta, made the decisive move that would seal the family's fate. Augusta, a woman whose iron will was matched only by her religious zealotry, purchased a 90-acre farm situated in the remote, sparsely populated township of Plainfield in Waushara County. This purchase, more than a practical business decision, was a calculated psychological move. Augusta was obsessed with keeping her boys, especially Ed, whom she viewed as delicate and highly susceptible to the perceived evils of the outside world. Utterly isolated, she viewed the townspeople, and indeed all non-believers, as morally corrupt, sinful, and destined for eternal damnation. The farmhouse itself, a lonely structure set far back from the road, became a kind of fortress designed to keep the profane world out and the Gein boys securely under her thumb. Let's take a moment to look closely at the parents, as their dynamic was the primary engine driving Ed's later pathology. George Gein, the passive spectator. George Gein was, by all accounts, a profoundly passive man. The narrative often paints him as an ineffectual, often drunken figure whose presence in the family was minimal. He was a local carpenter by trade, a man who, perhaps, had dreams of a simple, productive life. However, he was completely overshadowed by his dominant wife, Augusta. Their marriage was less a partnership and more a master-servant arrangement, with George serving as the economic provider and Augusta serving as the moral and emotional dictator. George was 10 years older than Augusta, and contemporary accounts suggest he found solace in alcohol, an escape that only fueled Augusta's righteous contempt for him and, by extension, for the perceived moral failings of men in general. His emotional withdrawal meant he provided absolutely no buffer or moderating influence for his sons against Augusta's extreme control. He essentially allowed the psychological abuse to take place unchecked. Augusta Gein, the fanatical architect. Augusta is, without question, the central figure in the early life of Ed Gein. Her religious beliefs were not merely devout. They were fanatical, puritanical, and intensely focused on the sinfulness of human sexuality. She was an adherent of a particularly conservative Lutheran denomination, and her faith formed the entire fabric of the Gein household. Every moment was a lesson in the depravity of man. She would preach constantly to her sons about the moral corruption and the lustful nature of all women, save for herself, casting herself as the sole, pure maternal figure capable of guiding them to salvation. These sermons were often accompanied by detailed, horrifying descriptions of eternal punishment waiting for those who indulged in sin. She instilled in Ed a paralyzing fear of women and sexuality that warped his natural development and made any healthy relationship outside the home completely impossible. This wasn't just typical strict parenting. It was an extreme form of psychological imprisonment. Every time Augusta addressed her sons, she was cementing the idea that the world outside the farmhouse was a pit of sin, and that any desire or natural curiosity was a direct path to hell. Ed, in particular, was the target of this constant, suffocating indoctrination. He was physically small, naturally timid, and deeply attached to his mother. He internalized her every word, creating a psychological foundation built on guilt, fear, and an intense, overwhelming Oedipal attachment that would ultimately define his existence. This environment created a man who was utterly dependent on his mother for his spiritual and emotional reality, leaving him without the tools to function in a normal social setting. The brothers' attempts to attend school in Plainfield were often hampered by the physical isolation of the farm and, more fundamentally, by Augusta's intense disapproval. When Ed did attend, he was relentlessly mocked by his peers for his peculiar clothes, his timidity, and his high-pitched laugh that many children found strange. He was a social outcast, and the ridicule he faced only confirmed Augusta's teachings. The outside world was cruel, and only she could protect him. Ed was poor at sports, had few friends, and spent most of his time isolated. His greatest joy was simply being near his mother, listening to her read from the Bible or dictate her harsh moral lessons. This pattern of psychological control and isolation continued unbroken throughout Ed's adolescence and into his early adulthood. The physical remoteness of the farm, several miles from the heart of Plainfield, acted as a tangible barrier, but Augusta's psychological walls were the truly impenetrable prison. The only true relief from this daily regimen of fanaticism was when Ed or Henry managed to find work outside the farm. However, even these brief excursions were met with severe disapproval from Augusta, who viewed any outside interaction as a threat to her dominion. The Gein farmhouse was a silent witness to this slow, insidious process of psychological fragmentation. It was a place where light seldom seemed to penetrate, literally and figuratively. Augusta's control meant that the farm was never properly maintained or modernized. It remained a relic, dusty and austere, a physical manifestation of her own rigid, backward-looking worldview. The interior of the house was kept tidy but grim, the parlor reserved only for Augusta's intense scripture-reading sessions. This house, the scene of such profound early torment, would decades later become the stage for the final, gruesome acts that shocked the world. The early years of Ed Gein were marked by a lack of genuine connection, a suppression of natural instincts, and a deep, ingrained fear of femininity and sexuality. This created a man who was incapable of forming a healthy adult identity. He did not grow up. He simply became a permanent, timid extension of his mother's will, a man with the body of an adult, but the emotional and social development of a child, trapped in a house designed by fear and commanded by a fanatical moralist. This foundation of intense emotional deformity would be the volatile material ignited by the next major loss in Ed's life, the death of his brother, Henry. The sheer, overwhelming nature of Augusta Gein's influence on her sons, particularly on Ed, cannot be overstated. It was the single most defining factor in his life, eclipsing his schooling, his few attempts at socializing, and even his working life. This section will explore the mechanics of her psychological control and the specific chilling ways in which it manifested in Ed's development, setting the stage for the pathology that would later emerge with such shocking clarity. Augusta's dominion was absolute. Every aspect of Ed's existence was filtered through her lens of biblical severity and sexual revulsion. The world, in her estimation, was populated by two types of people: her two sons, whom she was struggling to save from damnation, and everyone else, who were already lost. The farm itself, remote and lacking modern amenities, served as a physical tool for isolation, ensuring that her lessons were the only information source her boys received. When Ed would occasionally try to make a friend or show interest in a girl, a natural, innocent curiosity, Augusta's reaction was swift and devastatingly effective. She would launch into one of her protracted, terrifying diatribes about the depravity of women and the unholy nature of lust. These were not simple warnings. They were detailed, fear-inducing lectures that painted women as seductive agents of Satan, determined only to lead men to eternal fire. For a timid, sensitive boy like Ed, these constant sermons did not foster respect for her. They fostered paralyzing anxiety and a profound confusion regarding his own emergent adult sexuality. He became utterly incapable of distinguishing between healthy intimacy and the terrible sin his mother preached about. His natural desires were suppressed, and de Dechand, in a tragic twist of psychology, became intertwined with the very fear he felt for his mother's condemnation. The result was a classic, destructive Oedipal attachment. Augusta was the only good woman, the only pure one, and every other woman was a terrifying, sinful threat. This emotional dynamic was further compounded by his lack of a stable, healthy male role model, as his father, George, was distant and passive. Ed's attempts to integrate into the Plainfield community were clumsy and short-lived. His peers remembered him as shy, awkward, and possessing a strange, high-pitched giggle when nervous. His appearance, often dressed in clothes made or bought by Augusta, set him apart. He possessed a good intellect and was reportedly good at his schoolwork, but his social skills were non-existent. The few times he tried to work outside the farm, taking on odd jobs for neighbors, he was met with ridicule, which only served to reinforce Augusta's narrative that the outside world was hostile and that his only safe refuge was with her. The constant tension in the household eventually began to affect Henry, the older brother. Henry, a few years Ed's senior, was slightly more outgoing and less receptive to Augusta's extreme indoctrination. He was reportedly more concerned about the welfare of his younger brother and started to express open dissent against their mother's emotional tyranny. Henry recognized that Augusta's control was not merely strict, but actively detrimental to Ed's ability to function as an independent adult. This growing tension between Henry and Augusta, and Henry's attempts to pull Ed away from their mother's absolute control, would eventually lead to a tragic and deeply suspicious incident that further cemented Ed's fate. By the early 1940s, life on the Gein farm had settled into a grim routine. George Gein's drinking eventually led to his death in 1940 at the age of 66 due to heart failure. This loss had surprisingly little impact on the family dynamic, as George was already a marginalized, passive figure. His death simply removed the weakest link in the chain, leaving Henry and Ed in the sole, absolute power of Augusta. The emotional pressure continued to build, now exclusively focused on the two sons. Henry, increasingly frustrated, began to openly criticize Augusta to Ed, urging his younger brother to break free and recognize the damage their mother was doing. For Ed, who had internalized Augusta as a divine figure, this was a profound betrayal. The one person who loved him unconditionally and promised him salvation was being attacked by the one person who shared his confinement. These private arguments were a dangerous fault line in the Gein household, an attempt by Henry to introduce external, rational perspective into Ed's closed, emotionally poisoned world. This familial tension reached its devastating climax in the spring of 1944. The year 1944 marked the beginning of a rapid descent into the abyss for Ed Gein. His entire psychological structure, built on the dependency on his mother and the suppression of his own desires, was about to be profoundly tested by the dramatic removal of two key figures. First his brother, Henry, and then, most crucially, his mother, Augusta. The death of Henry Gein, in particular, remains one of the most ambiguous and disturbing elements of the entire Ed Gein story. An incident wrapped in circumstantial evidence and the silence of a troubled mind. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were working together on a brush-burning detail on their farm. This was a common seasonal chore in rural Wisconsin, clearing fields by burning away dead brush and debris. According to Ed's account, the fire quickly got out of control, spreading rapidly across the dry, late spring fields. The local volunteer fire department was called to the scene to assist in extinguishing the blaze. During the chaos of fighting the fire, Henry disappeared. When the fire was finally brought under control, Ed was the first to report that he couldn't find his older brother. The disappearance triggered a brief search. Hours later, Ed led the search party, which included members of the fire crew and local law enforcement, directly to Henry's body. Henry was found lying on the ground in an area that had supposedly been searched already, a strange detail that raised minor questions even at the time. The official cause of death was pronounced as asphyxiation due to the fire. Henry was 42 years old, while the death was officially ruled an accident, likely due to smoke inhalation during the frantic firefighting. The circumstances contained several unsettling discrepancies that would only be reconsidered years later, after the full extent of Ed's pathology was revealed. First and most notably, Henry's body was found in a patch of ground that hadn't actually been consumed by the fire, suggesting he hadn't succumbed while fighting it, but rather had died just outside the immediate flame area. Furthermore, Henry's physical condition, he was a robust man, made smoke inhalation as the primary cause of death questionable, especially when Ed, who was smaller and less physically enduring, had emerged from the ordeal relatively unharmed. The most damning circumstance, known only to Ed and Henry themselves, was the escalating emotional conflict. Henry had been actively, openly criticizing Augusta's influence to Ed, sometimes even confronting her directly. Henry was attempting to rescue Ed from his own mother's psychological prison. For Ed, this was a terrifying internal conflict. The good son, Henry, who loved him, was attacking the good woman, Augusta, who guaranteed his salvation. It is highly plausible, though purely speculation based on the later confession regarding the murder of Bernice Worden, that Henry's attempts to break Ed's attachment were perceived by Ed as a direct existential threat to his world order, the one created and maintained by Augusta. When the later murder revelations came out, investigators did revisit Henry's case and even exhumed the body for a deeper look. However, given the initial surface-level autopsy and the extensive decomposition after years in the ground, no conclusive evidence of foul play could be established, and the official ruling of accidental death was never overturned. It is highly likely, however, that Henry Gein was Ed Gein's first victim, murdered because he threatened Ed's complete emotional servitude to Augusta. For Ed, Henry's death was a deeply complex, if not contradictory, event. On one hand, the single source of critical dissent in the house was gone. Henry was the only person who offered an external reality to counter Augusta's internal, fanatic one. With him removed, Ed was left alone with his mother, the dynamic he cherished most, completely intact and unchallenged. The psychological pressure that Henry had been building, urging Ed toward independence, was suddenly released. On the other hand, it was a profound loss that left a gaping hole in the Gein household and moved Ed one step closer to complete isolation. He now shared the farm and the terrifying, silent reality of Augusta's mental world with no one else. Ed and Augusta suddenly had to rely solely on each other. Ed began taking on more odd jobs around Plainfield, acting as a handyman, carpenter, and seasonal laborer. He was known as a reliable, quiet worker, if a bit strange, and this income helped sustain them. He earned a small but steady reputation for his helpful nature, a profound contrast to the dark secrets that were already beginning to churn beneath his quiet exterior. This brief period of codependence, lasting just over a year and a half, was the final critical stage of Ed's psychological breakdown. Augusta was growing increasingly frail due to declining health, including a series of debilitating strokes. Ed became her full-time caregiver, a role he embraced with the zealous dedication of a true believer. This was his highest calling, serving the one pure woman in a sinful world. Every meal prepared, every blanket adjusted, every quiet night spent by her bedside reaffirmed his purpose and secured his salvation in her eyes. But this period was tragically short. The death of Augusta Gein in 1945 was not simply a personal loss for Ed. It was an apocalypse. She passed away from a massive stroke at the age of 67, leaving her 40-year-old son completely, irreversibly alone. The woman who had been the entire sun, moon, and gravity of his existence was suddenly gone, leaving him drifting in a silent, moral vacuum he was utterly unprepared to navigate. Ed's subsequent actions in the farmhouse were a direct, desperate reaction to this profound loss of structure, purpose, and identity. Ed's immediate response was telling, a silent, macabre statement of his inability to let go. He did not sell the farm. He did not clear out the house or attempt to modernize it. Instead, he sealed off his mother's bedroom, the living room, and a specific downstairs parlor area. These rooms became shrines, sacred spaces, preserved exactly as they were at the moment of Augusta's death. The rest of the house, the kitchen, and his own small room fell into a state of utter disrepair, becoming filthy, cluttered, and neglected. But Augusta's rooms remained pristine, protected by layers of dust and the profound, silent terror of a man who could not bear to disturb the air his idol had last breathed. This sealing off created a paradoxical environment. The house became both an intensely private museum, dedicated to a lost life, and a chaotic, deteriorating den for Ed's spiraling fixation. Outside the farmhouse, Ed continued to work occasional odd jobs, serving as a respected local handyman, babysitter for neighbors' children, and farm laborer. He earned enough to keep the farm from foreclosure and himself from starvation, but he'd rarely socialized. His routine was rigidly solitary. He would read macabre pulp magazines, listen to the radio, and, most crucially, spend untold hours alone in the silence, tormented by the absence of the one person who gave his life meaning. The loss of his primary figure of authority and affection created a void that Ed was desperate to fill. Augusta had instilled in him a deep revulsion toward women, but she had also fostered an overwhelming dependence on a feminine presence. Now that his singular maternal figure was gone, Ed sought a replacement, since no living woman could possibly measure up to Augusta's impossible standard of purity. And since Ed was pathologically terrified of normal female interaction, he turned to the dead. The transition from mere pathological fixation to criminal action began with grave robbing, an act not driven by violence or malice toward the living, but by a morbid, desperate attempt to literally recreate or possess the female form. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed confessed to making between 40 and 50 nocturnal visits to 3 local cemeteries. His targets were recent burials of middle-aged women whom he believed resembled his late mother, Augusta, in either age or physical characteristics. Gein claimed that he was often in a trance-like state during these excursions, sometimes returning home without recalling whether he had actually gone through with the desecration. The methodology of his grave robbing was detailed and clinical. He would typically exhume the remains, but only take certain parts, often the heads, which he kept, and the skin, which he used for his horrific projects. He confessed that sometimes he would leave the grave open or partially re-inter the body, not out of carelessness, but perhaps out of a bizarre sense of deference or ritual. The initial motivation, as Ed confessed, was a desire to experiment with the anatomy of the female body, to understand the mysteries that Augusta had forbidden him to approach. But as the grave robbing continued, the motivation twisted into something more disturbing, a desire to create a woman suit or a mama suit, a physical means of transitioning his identity to that of a woman, perhaps even his mother, or at least inhabiting a new feminine form. This desire to physically embody the female form stemmed from his deep-seated gender confusion and transvestism, rooted in his inability to form a masculine identity separate from his dominant mother. It is essential to understand that at this stage, Ed was largely acting on the bodies of the dead, focusing on preservation and fabrication, not active murder. The psychological barrier to killing a living person was still largely intact, protected by the residual fear of Augusta's condemnation. The grave robbing was his bridge, his way of satisfying his grotesque urges without committing the cardinal sin of actual violence against the living. He saw the dead as property, as raw materials for his artistic and psychological needs. The farmhouse, previously a shrine, now became a workshop and gallery of human remains. This decade of utter isolation, financed by odd jobs and filled with the silence of Augusta's ghost, saw Ed Gein transform from a timid mama's boy into a macabre artist of the dead, preparing for a final terrifying break with reality. His life became a dual existence, the quiet, reliable handyman of Plainfield by day, and the reclusive creator of horrors by night. The small town's trust in him was absolute, making the coming revelation all the more catastrophic. The silent decade of grave robbing and macabre creation eventually transitioned into the unimaginable act of murder. The psychological barrier that separated the desecration of the dead from the slaying of the living was finally breached, likely due to the increasingly desperate nature of Ed's needs and his growing confidence that his actions would never be discovered. His first confirmed victim was Mary Hogan, a 45-year-old Plainfield local whose disappearance in 1954 cast a brief but unsettling shadow over the quiet community. Mary Hogan was a well-known figure in Plainfield. She ran the Hogan's Tavern, a popular, if unassuming, local watering hole located just a short distance from the center of town. Mary was a straightforward, perhaps somewhat tough woman, accustomed to managing the rowdier elements of a small-town bar crowd. She was known to be genial but firm, a person of established routine, and a fixture in the community's social life. Mary's Tavern was a place where local farmers and laborers came to unwind, share gossip, and escape the oppressive quiet of the rural isolation. It was, in many ways, the antithesis of the Gein farmhouse, a place of human connection, alcohol, and the very sin that Augusta Gein had so vehemently preached against. Mary Hogan disappeared on December 8, 1954. The details of that evening are sparse, but the key facts are chillingly consistent. Mary was alone in the tavern that night, likely cleaning up after closing hours, when Ed Gein arrived. The next morning, the tavern was found deserted. There were signs of a struggle. Bloodstains were visible on the floor, and a spent shell casing was found nearby. There was no doubt among local law enforcement and the townspeople that Mary had met with foul play. However, in a small town where people often left suddenly for work or personal reasons, the initial reaction was confusion, quickly followed by a pervasive, unsettling fear. The only strong lead came from an anonymous local who reported seeing a strange vehicle or person near the tavern that night. Ed Gein, the quiet, reliable handyman, was nowhere near the top of the short list of suspects. The disappearance of Mary Hogan became Plainfield's first significant, active mystery. The town, accustomed to the silence of rural life, was now gripped by an unnerving, low-grade fear. Locals speculated openly. Was it a traveling psychopath, a disgruntled customer, or had Mary simply decided to leave town? The investigation led nowhere. Without a body, without a clear witness, and without any definitive physical evidence pointing to a specific individual, the case quickly stalled. It slipped into the category of unsolved local mystery, the kind of case that people whispered about in the diner, but eventually learned to live with. However, the rumors and speculation were far more accurate than the official investigation. It was often rumored locally that the murderer was a specific, troubled individual who lived nearby. Even years later, people would still joke darkly about Mary Hogan being in Ed Gein's house, a local jest that turned out to be, tragically, horribly true. This local lore, fueled by Gein's eccentric, isolated lifestyle, provides a disturbing insight into the unconscious level of suspicion the community held toward him, a suspicion that was consistently dismissed due to his harmless demeanor. Mary Hogan's disappearance would remain unsolved for 3 years, until the investigation into Bernice Worden's murder cracked the case wide open. Only then, under intense interrogation, did Ed Gein finally confess to Mary Hogan's murder. Gein described the murder as an act that originated with his transvestic urges. He claimed he shot her with a rifle, and then, according to his later detailed confession, he carried her body back to the farmhouse. He later used parts of her remains for his horrifying collection and craft work, including transforming her face into a macabre mask. The motive, as later interpreted by psychologists and investigators, was not entirely robbery or hatred, but a complex mix of morbid desire, psychological substitution, and a need for material for his artistic urges. The act of murder, once committed against Mary Hogan, broke the final psychological barrier. The dead became his source material, and if the dead were his source material, then any living woman who resembled the ultimate feminine ideal, his mother, or a woman who could be transformed into her, became a potential resource. The Mary Hogan case established a grim template: a lone woman, a remote location, a quick, brutal act, and a complete, years-long silence from the community. It was the successful, unchallenged execution of this first murder that arguably emboldened Ed Gein, leading him to believe he was truly invisible and untouchable in his isolation, setting the stage for the final critical error that would expose everything. 3 years after the disappearance of Mary Hogan, the fragile peace of Plainfield was shattered again, this time irrevocably, by the disappearance of Bernice Worden. Unlike the Hogan case, this incident would not remain a quiet, unsolved mystery. The circumstances surrounding Bernice's disappearance were so specific, so immediately alarming, that they forced a direct confrontation with the darkness lurking on the Gein farm. Bernice Worden, 58 years old, was another familiar and well-respected figure in the Plainfield community. She was a widow who ran the Worden hardware store, a small, essential business in the center of town. Bernice was known as a hard-working, friendly, and reliable businesswoman. She was the matriarch of her family and a steady presence in the local commerce, embodying the very quiet, dependable values of rural Wisconsin life. Crucially, Bernice was also someone who knew Ed Gein. He was a regular customer at her store, purchasing various items for his odd jobs and the farm. He was known to her and perhaps even more importantly, to her son. The murder of Bernice Worden took place on Saturday, November 16th, 1957. This date would forever be etched in the grim history of Plainfield. Bernice was last seen late that afternoon in her store. Ed Gein confessed to visiting the hardware store and, in a manner chillingly similar to the Hogan case, shooting her with a .22 caliber rifle. The act was swift and brutal. Gein then loaded Bernice's body into the back of the Worden store's truck, along with the store's cash register. The inclusion of the cash register was either a clumsy attempt to stage the scene as a robbery, or a detail born of Ed's confusion in the moment. As he later confessed, he only took the body and the cash register, leaving the rest of the store untouched. The disappearance was immediately noticed, not by a late-night patron, but by the person whose routine was most tied to hers, her son, Frank Worden. Frank, a Waushara County deputy sheriff, returned to the store late that Saturday night and found it locked and empty. This was instantly alarming, as Bernice was not one to leave without explanation. Frank Worden's inspection of the scene yielded the single, most critical piece of evidence that led directly to Ed Gein. On the floor of the hardware store, Frank found a sales slip dated for that day, showing the sale of a gallon of antifreeze. The purchaser, Ed Gein. This slip was more than just a receipt. It was an unimpeachable link. Ed Gein had been the last person officially documented to have been in the store before Bernice vanished. Frank, already aware of the old, dark local rumors concerning Ed and Mary Hogan, immediately realized the gravity of the situation. The antifreeze purchase could have been for his car, but the confluence of the purchase, the bloodstains, the missing cash register, and the local rumors was too suspicious to ignore. Frank immediately notified the authorities, including Waushara County Sheriff Art Schley. Sheriff Schley and a small team began the investigation, quickly locating Ed Gein at a local eatery. He was taken into custody immediately for questioning. The initial interrogation focused on the antifreeze purchase and his knowledge of Bernice's disappearance. Ed was calm, passive, and utterly unremarkable, maintaining the facade of the timid, harmless handyman. However, the pressure was mounting. The sheriff's department had the slip, the knowledge of the Hogan case, and the rapidly growing fear that a predator was operating in their town. As the interrogation continued, Sheriff Schley made the decisive move that would change the course of American crime history. He dispatched Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden and a few other officers to search the Gein farmhouse. The suspicion, fueled by the antifreeze receipt and the memory of Mary Hogan, was strong enough to warrant a physical inspection of the remote property. The officers set out for the Gein farm, approximately 1 mile west of Plainfield, a journey that would lead them directly into the nightmare Ed Gein had been cultivating in silence and isolation for over a decade. The discovery that awaited them would prove that the rumors were not just true, but that they had only scratched the surface of a horror that defied simple description. The evening of November 16th, 1957, was cold and dark as Sheriff Art Schley and Deputy Frank Worden, along with several other investigators, made their way down the long, lonely driveway toward the Gein farmhouse. This moment, the breaching of Ed Gein's sealed-off world, is the pivot point of the entire story, transitioning from a local mystery into a national macabre spectacle. What they found inside was not just evidence of murder, but a perverse, meticulously curated gallery of human remains that remains shocking to this day. The first major discovery was made almost immediately upon entering the ramshackle farmhouse. Deputy Frank Worden and his colleagues found a small utility shed just outside the main house. Hanging upside down from a crossbeam was a body, fully dressed and suspended by ropes tied around the ankles. Initially, due to the dim light and the way the body was butchered, the deputies believed it was a deer carcass, perhaps illegally hunted. But upon closer inspection, the horrific truth became apparent. This was the body of Bernice Worden. Her body had been decapitated and expertly field-dressed, having been slit down the torso. The gruesome details of the preparation suggested a level of skill and attachment that was instantly terrifying. The initial description of a deer carcass was soon corrected to the unthinkable. Once the presence of Bernice Worden's body was confirmed, a full search warrant was executed, and investigators began the painstaking, sickening inventory of the house. The interior of the Gein farmhouse was a study in profound psychological breakdown. The house was filthy, cluttered with junk, and overwhelmingly pungent, except for the sealed-off rooms of Augusta, which remained untouched and dusty. It was in the remaining lived-in sections, the kitchen and Ed's small room, that the items were found. The artifacts, painstakingly crafted and preserved, revealed the extent of Ed Gein's decade-long obsession with creating a second, substitute feminine presence. Human skin artifacts, lampshades, made from tanned human skin, stretched and stitched onto frames. Wastebasket, also covered with human skin. Chair, upholstery, strips of human skin used to reupholster chairs, curious vest, bodice, a vest or bodice fashioned from a female torso, complete with breasts, worn by Ed Gein himself, a direct manifestation of his woman suit fantasy, leggings, trousers crafted from human leg skin, belts made from strips of skin, with breasts affixed to one, perhaps to be worn as a harness or bib, bones and skulls, soup bowls, found in the kitchen, made from the tops of human skulls, skulls on bedposts. Several skulls were found displayed on Ed's bedposts, used as decoration. Skull caps. Ed had sawed off the tops of several skulls to fashion crude bowls. Nose and lips. A box was found containing a preserved human nose and human lips. Mary Hogan. Evidence. Face mask. Investigators found a mask made from the tanned skin of a human face, later identified as belonging to Mary Hogan. This discovery was the critical link that solved the 3-year-old cold case. Head in a burlap sack. Mary Hogan's head was found separately, packed in a burlap sack in a different area of the house. The discovery was not simply a collection of gruesome trophies. It was a museum of identity substitution. Ed Gein was not just collecting parts. He was using them to fabricate a new identity, or perhaps attempting to physically manifest the pure, idealized feminine figure that his mother had embodied. The sheer normalization of these horrors within the farmhouse context, human remains used as household objects, demonstrated the complete break Ed had made with social and moral reality. While the inventory was being conducted at the farm, Ed Gein was still being interrogated at the Washara County Sheriff's Office. When confronted with the evidence found at the farm, specifically the body of Bernice Worden, Ed Gein confessed immediately and quietly. His confession included the details of both the Bernice Worden murder and the earlier unsolved murder of Mary Hogan. He provided details about his grave robbing activities, explaining that most of the non-victim remains came from his nocturnal visits to local cemeteries. He even confessed that the body parts were typically obtained from the local Plainfield graveyard, stating he would enter the cemetery after a recent burial of an older woman. The confession was delivered in a calm, matter-of-fact tone, devoid of remorse or any apparent emotional distress, a chilling testament to his profound psychological detachment. The news of the discovery at the Gein farm immediately exploded into a national frenzy. Plainfield, Wisconsin, was instantly transformed from a quiet farming community into the literal backdrop of a horror film. Journalists, photographers, and curious onlookers descended upon the farm, turning the macabre crime scene into a sensational spectacle. The images and descriptions, filtered through the early mass media, shocked the collective American consciousness. The farmhouse itself became an object of morbid fascination. However, it was never destined to stand as a permanent monument to its dark history. The house was sold at auction in 1958, but just before the new owner could take possession, the house burned down in a mysterious fire. Many locals suspected arson, perhaps a desperate attempt by the community to cleanse itself of the stain of Ed Gein's atrocities, or simply to ensure that the physical location of the horror could never be exploited. Whatever the cause, the house burned, leaving behind only the cold Wisconsin earth and the terrifying memories of what it had concealed for so long. The arrest and confession of Ed Gein marked the end of the immediate investigation and the beginning of a complex, tumultuous legal and institutional journey that would span decades. The sheer brutality and bizarre nature of his crimes immediately raised profound questions about his sanity and competency, questions that overshadowed any simple application of criminal law. Ed Gein was initially charged with the murder of Bernice Worden. However, given the nature of the evidence, the grave robbing, the use of human remains as furniture, and the disturbing transvestic urges, it was immediately clear that his mental state would be the defining factor in the case. In 1957, a competency hearing was swiftly convened. The psychiatric evaluations conducted at the time concluded that Ed Gein was definitively not guilty by reason of insanity. He was found to be mentally ill and incapable of assisting in his own defense or understanding the charges against him. The finding led to his immediate commitment to a state mental health facility. Gein was first sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, an institution designed to hold individuals deemed a danger to society due to mental illness. His years there were a period of intense psychiatric observation, where he often spoke to doctors about his deep-seated need to physically become a woman, a desire directly traced back to his mother's suffocating influence. During his time in state custody, Gein was extensively studied. One of the key psychiatrists involved in his evaluation was Dr. George W. Arndt, who spent considerable time trying to unravel the tangled skein of Ed's mind. The findings consistently pointed to his severe mental disorders, schizophrenia, manifesting as chronic undifferentiated type, and sexual psychopathy with a focus on necrophilia and transvestism. The doctors concluded that Ed Gein was so fundamentally detached from reality that his crimes were the product of a severe delusion and an inability to understand the wrongfulness of his actions in the context of society. His internal moral compass was still solely guided by the fanatical, long-dead Augusta, who provided him with a perverse rationale for his actions, that the bodies of the dead were merely objects, not people, and therefore his actions were not murder in the biblical or legal sense. The legal saga of Ed Gein was not over, however. In 1968, Wisconsin state authorities decided to try him again, specifically on the charge of murdering Bernice Worden. This decision was based on the belief that, while still profoundly ill, Gein had reached a state of relative mental stability and was technically competent to stand trial and understand the legal proceedings against him. The trial took place in November 1968, more than a decade after the crimes. It was a brief, highly focused affair. The defense counsel, Frank J. Malarkey, argued for the insanity defense, while the prosecution focused on the irrefutable evidence of the murder itself. The proceedings ended quickly. The judge ruled that Gein was guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden, but immediately proceeded to a second phase of the trial, a finding on the insanity plea. In the second phase, the judge ruled that Ed Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity at the time of the commission of the crime. This was a critical legal distinction. He had committed the act, guilty, but he was not criminally responsible for it due to his mental state. Not guilty by reason of insanity. The immediate legal consequence was that Ed Gein was returned to the state hospital, where he was to remain confined indefinitely. The saga of Ed Gein, from the discovery of the farmhouse in 1957 to the 1968 trial, was a constant source of media fascination. The sensational nature of the crimes, the butcher of Plainfield, seemed to tap into a primal, horrified curiosity in the American public. The press coverage was intense and often hyperbolic, transforming Ed Gein from a deeply damaged, isolated man into a terrifying monster of mythic proportions. This media frenzy quickly laid the groundwork for his unprecedented cultural legacy. The unique, macabre elements of the case, the digging up of graves, the making of skin suits and masks, the psychological motivation driven by an all-consuming mother, provided immediate, potent material for storytellers. The media's sensationalism was the bridge that brought the horror from the quiet Wisconsin farmhouse directly into the nation's cultural bloodstream, paving the way for the creation of iconic horror villains in cinema. Throughout the legal and institutional process, Ed Gein remained a quiet, compliant, and remarkably gentle patient in the hospital setting. His outward demeanor was completely at odds with the terror he had unleashed, a paradox that only deepened the disturbing nature of his case. Following his second trial in 1968, Ed Gein's life settled into a protracted period of institutionalization. He was transferred between several mental facilities, including the Mendota State Hospital in Madison and the Central State Hospital in Waupun. This final chapter of his life, spanning over 15 years, was marked by a strange, almost mundane quietude, a stark contrast to the violence and chaos of his crimes. In the institutional environment, Ed Gein was often described as a model patient. He was quiet, compliant, and never exhibited any violence towards staff or other patients. He worked in the facility's laundry and was often trusted with minor responsibilities. His high-pitched, nervous giggle, a characteristic noted since childhood, persisted. But his overall demeanor was one of passive contentment. The rigid structure of the hospital environment ironically provided him with the very thing he had lacked his entire life: external structure and control. In the hospital, he was fully taken care of, relieving him of the burdens of managing the farm, earning a living, and navigating the complexities of the outside world that Augusta had taught him to fear. He received the medical and psychological attention he needed, even if the underlying pathology was too deep-seated to cure. The institutional walls became a new, safer version of Augusta's psychological prison, one that was protective rather than destructive. Periodically, Ed Gein would come up for parole or conditional release hearings. His doctors, noting his non-violent behavior within the hospital, sometimes offered cautious reports. However, the nature of his crimes and the powerful, lingering public and political opposition meant that any attempt at release was immediately and fiercely shut down. The consensus among the public and the legal system was that the Butcher of Plainfield could never be released. He was seen as too great a risk, and perhaps more accurately, too great a symbol of ultimate unforgivable horror. Ed Gein passed away on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, at the Mendota State Hospital in Madison. His death was attributed to respiratory failure and cancer. He was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery next to his mother, Augusta, in an unmarked grave, finally reunited in death with the figure who had dominated his life. His tombstone was later vandalized, chipped away by souvenir seekers, a final grim testament to the notoriety of his name. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Ed Gein's story is its profound and lasting impact on popular culture, specifically the horror genre. His crimes, which blended psychological pathology with the macabre use of human remains as clothing and household objects, provided the blueprint for some of the most enduring and terrifying villains in American cinema. Norman Bates' Psycho, 1960. Robert Bloch's 1959 novel, Psycho, and Alfred Hitchcock's subsequent 1960 film adaptation were the first major fictional works to be directly inspired by Ed Gein. Norman Bates, the timid, taxidermy-obsessed killer whose life is dominated by his overbearing, controlling mother, is a clear, thinly veiled psychological portrait of Gein. The concept of the mother's preserved influence and the inability of the killer to form an independent identity are central to both the Gein case and the psycho narrative. Leatherface, The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, 1974. Tobe Hooper's iconic 1974 film drew heavily on the most visceral and shocking elements of the Gein case. Leatherface, the massive mute killer who wears masks made of human skin and whose house is adorned with bones and grotesque artifacts, is a direct, terrifying visual translation of the discoveries made in the Plainfield farmhouse. The setting of a remote, isolated Texas farm mirrors the Wisconsin setting, and the sheer brutality and psychological oddity of the family unit reflect the bizarre normalization of Gein's crimes. The human skin mask is the most direct artifactual link, pulled straight from the Mary Hogan evidence. James Gum, Buffalo Bill, The Silence of the Lambs, 1988 to 1991. The character of James Gum, or Buffalo Bill, the killer who murders women to skin them and fashion a woman's suit for himself, is a precise narrative echo of Ed Gein's transvestic and psychological motivations. Gein's expressed desire to create a mama suit, to transition into a female form, is the exact core motivation driving the fictional killer in The Silence of the Lambs. Ed Gein's story is a terrifying blend of psychological dysfunction and criminal pathology. It is a cautionary tale about the devastating effects of extreme isolation and psychological abuse, and how, in the absence of normal human connection, the mind can turn inward and construct a reality entirely divorced from morality and law. The legacy of Ed Gein is not just the memory of the two women he murdered, Mary Hogan and Bernice Verdon, and the graves he robbed, but the creation of a terrifying template for the American psycho killer, a figure that continues to haunt our darkest stories.